Welcome to the Common Good Podcast, where change agents in the social sector, community, and faith meet at the intersections of belonging, imagination, and gifts. I'm your host, Troy Bronsink from The Hive in Cincinnati, Ohio. In this pilot season, our conversation is rooted in the relationship of three thought leaders whose lives' work have deeply informed the other. Walter Brueggemann, Peter Block, and John McKnight are friends whose complementary disciplines of biblical studies, organizational behavior, and community organizing have provocatively challenged the other. You'll notice how these three can hardly talk about their areas of expertise without borrowing from each other's life's work and without a little bit of laughter and a healthy dose of humility. Today's episode deals with the paradox between the richness of deep neighborliness and the tendency for a sense of close-knitted community to create those conditions that exclude the stranger.
Every group that we're interested in creates a commitment within and exclusion without. And our job is to be the people inside who work to ensure a welcome at the edge.
As with the other episodes of this series, you'll note the three returning to metaphors of covenant from the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, regardless of your faith, you'll see how this ancient biblical narrative provides an alternative to the modern notions of building walls and competitive contracts, how covenant freely invites partnership and agency towards a possible future. We pick up the conversation where Peter responds to a question about the nature of community.
I think the word covenant is the starting place to your question, and what I've appreciated it. In your writing, Walter, it's a covenant with God is the launching pan, and that we cry out, and then God gets interested.
That's right. That's right.
And that cry and God's interested, your double agency, God and Moses as a team. Pharaoh and Joseph weren't able to create that. But God and Moses did. And they invited us to imagine not being slaves.
That's right.
And then God was a deal maker. My understanding through you is that God said, well, if you follow these covenants,
that's right,
and you list the 10 Commandments as all you need, and in your eyes, you probably have 5 extra. Basically, you need the 10th commandment, the rest will follow. And it's a covenant is a promise. It's a promise made with no expectation of return. There's
right.
Something demanded of you, but you chose it. It wasn't because it was demanded. Say a little more about God, our covenant with God, and how God navigated those waters, because he got very upset at times.
I think in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible that the covenant is a negotiation of promise and obligation, and in different contexts you get the promise. So then the covenant is almost unilateral, in which God says, "I unconditionally commit to you." But at other times, the accent is all on the obligation. And if you want this relationship, you have to do this, and it's conditional. And Christian theology historically has erred by stressing the unconditional and accusing Jews of stressing only the conditional. Mm-hmm. When in fact what the tradition shows, it's always both, as it is in all of our human covenants. So you talk about loving your children unconditionally. I don't know anyone who loves their children unconditionally. Like, you better get your ass in gear. Though I did discover that I came much closer to unconditional with my second son than with my first son. Which I suspect is that's how it works.
Wisdom.
The first one, get it right. Yeah. So it's always a sort of a playful negotiation about how you tilt that and give nuance to it, I think.
Both are always true.
Yeah.
Whether you speak it or not.
George Lakoff who's this big-time philosopher, has written a book recently in which he says that conservatives, without reflecting on it, have a notion that the world is governed by a demanding father. And liberals, without thinking about it, have a notion that the world is governed by a nutrient mother. So that the conversation just goes like that.
And they're both true.
They're both true, yeah. But you can't have just one of them. That's the problem. Yeah.
And that's why it's probably what produces violence is adherence to both, either as a one.
That's right, yeah. So that when you think about the stringent father, all of this talk about, and I've read a couple books about that recently, all this talk about austerity, about money, like in Europe, it's not an economic argument, it's a moral argument. It's a moral argument that these people need to shape up, which is what the work requirement for welfare is all about. It's not an economic argument; it's a moral argument that we need to help these people not be lazy.
Very nice.
Which denies the reality that it's hard work to be poor.
That's right, exactly.
Also, I just keep thinking about the government now providing lunches instead of food stamps. It's a further centralization, thinking it's more efficient, lower cost. It gives us leverage.
That's right.
It's Pharaoh all the way.
There's a letter to the editor of the Times this morning that says, this is the perfect expression of the nanny state. We will decide what food you need.
And I would guess there'd be some Fritos and Coca-Cola in that package.
That's right.
In his book, Community, the Structure of Belonging, Peter writes, "The real task of leadership is to confront people with their freedom. This may be the ultimate act of love that is called for from those who hold power over us." We take the conversation a little deeper and begin to make this connection between confronting people with their freedom in order to create a space of accountability. And here's Peter.
Well, I think the word, what do we want from each other? I think that's a very useful way to get connected. I need to know what you want from me. It's irrelevant as to whether you get it or not. And I like the covenant because it gives every aspect of our relationship a sacred dimension. And I'm not sure what covenant means, but that's the beauty of the word. And I would not lump skill sets. When you talk about things that are so insanely simple, hardly call them a skill. Right. If you and I are working together and I say, what do you want from me? I don't have to go to a workshop. Well, I do have to go to a workshop. But the workshop...
I've been to your workshop where you did that.
And the whole point of the workshop is to make the point that there's nothing else to talk about. For years, one of the falsehoods of my existence was I asked people in high conflict situations, I say, just be quiet for a second and listen, okay? Now tell them how you feel. Thank you. Tell them how, and I said to friend Tim, I said, all I do is ask people how they feel and what they want. And I make a living at that. He says, what else is there? And so it's establishing that these conversations are valuable to have. It's not so much a skill on how to have them. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with covenant. When Walter talks about covenant as being a promise and an obligation. It's my naming the obligation that I'm willing to take on. It's my making the promise I'm making that transforms our relationship. God or some mysterious force will decide whether it comes to pass or not. People say, I always keep my word. And I said, that's not possible. What are you talking about? You always keep my word. If I keep my word, once a week, I get on my knees and say, what happened? It was an accident. And I think what you're saying, Walter, is all these become moral. I think calling them skills or becoming moral, there's some way of taking the judgment out of it and saying, how do we engage in the practice of? So the skill is the awareness to practice this. And it's useful. So I know, after living with John all these years, that I cannot end a meeting by asking people, what gifts did you exchange with each other in the last 10 minutes you've been together? And I know if we end with that conversation, I don't care what they say. I'm not interested in your projection of what my gifts are. Take all the instruments you want, the Mia, Via. I'm giving a talk at the Enneagram this summer at a conference. I'm a keynote speaker. And the woman who invited me, she said, well, are you a 3 or a 9? And I said, absolutely. So I think the ritual part is to say there's certain things that we engage in with each other, outcome free. And so the covenant tags that for me, the language of covenant. No, do we have time? The obligation, all the things that the two of you talk about. It takes years to understand that that's all there is. And the language of abundance. So to define it, to train it, to teach it, is a back doorway of getting us to value what's healing. And I think with God as an agent, that evokes a set of languages that are useful to us. This is what I value from the church. As you've legitimized forgiveness, confession, compassion. We don't have to explain that. If we worked for a corporation, we would have to define those terms and train people against them. That's how they weave together. The gifts is something that I know if we pay attention to, something in me relaxes a little bit. And I know if it's covenant, the language of covenant, then somehow and I love the notion of say, what's the promise you're willing to make? And a beautiful answer is, nothing comes to mind at the moment. And that's an intimate relationship. That's because if I answered your question, I would be engaged in lip service. Lip service is what's required in a predatory economy. So I don't know, you can float among these words.
There's something else we ought to say, I think, about covenant. My family, McKnights, if you said who are they? They're Covenanters.
You're the credentialed
religious group, right? And their name was Covenanters. And they still exist, about 5,000 in the world now. And so we had a covenant among us, right, that was strong. And we had our way, and it was distinctive. We wouldn't vote because when we came here, from Scotland, because the Constitution allowed slavery. We couldn't participate in a government like that, right? We had our way. And I've mentioned this before, but I was never told if I did something my parents didn't like, that's bad, don't do that. I was told, McKnights don't do that, which was to say, you are a part of a covenanted community and you violated the collective value, right? And that was a wonderful thing.
That's right.
However, we were exclusive rather than inclusive in our orientation. The world out there was sinful, a place to be avoided. And so, as in associational life, free-formed, committed groups to people to each other, there is always this tension, and I've seen it over and over again, between the covenant among us and the exclusivity that may be the result of that. I was trying to get a authoritative definition of community that I could use, and you can't get that from sociologists. But one sociologist said, community is at least a group of people who come together around some affinity. And in doing that, they always create outsiders. This is the issue that I see very much at the heart of a lot of our troubles, is how do you gain the benefit of the covenant and yet understand it in an inclusive rather than an exclusive way? Now, Walter, help me out.
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect it is in a refusal to absolutize that our lines of exclusion are provisional and always have to be renegotiated. The problem is when the lines become hard and absolute, and then there's no possibility of movement. So I think the other side of covenant is that it is always under negotiation. And I think the Jewish theology understood that if you reach a final settlement of covenant, you will arrive at a final solution. So the whole rabbinic tradition is it's always being reinterpreted and renegotiated. And
It's where the question is more powerful than the answer.
that's right. That's exactly right.
I've always sensed that Jesus, in my mind, was a person given to inclusiveness and forgiveness, and might be for some people, for me, a response to the limits and the dangers of the parochialism of a covenant. Right?
Well, I think that's right. Yeah. So the biggest move made in the New Testament is the inclusion of Gentiles into this Jewish covenant.
Yeah.
And of course, the New Testament can't figure it out.
Yes.
Paul writes and writes and writes, and he really doesn't know what to say. But I think that's right. Yeah.
Say more about that, the inclusion of Gentiles. What doesn't Paul know what to say about?
Well, he wants to continue to insist that the Jews are the chosen people. And he wants to insist that Gentiles are first-class citizens in the covenant with God. And you can't say both those things.
So
He says both
Christian.
those things.
Right.
Yeah.
And always kept it intense. Never had a resolution.
I think that's right. Yeah. So the famous part is in Romans 9 through 11, in which he just tortures himself about trying to get this said in some way. He makes it very complex.
And so then, would you say then the nature of the text of the New Testament then is like it manifests that paradox? Like it...
Oh, yeah, I think that's
it just
right.
basically, it doesn't solve that paradox, it just
That's right.
owns it.
And in early Judaism, in the post-exilic period, the same thing is under negotiation. It's the question of who can be a good Jew. And on the one hand, the Ezra tradition is very exclusive. And on the other hand, the Isaiah tradition argues that foreigners and eunuchs of all people, foreigners and eunuchs can be part of the covenant.
He was
Which
the
means-
uncredentialed one, wasn't
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So in Judaism, I mean, the Christians were not the first ones to see the problem. Judaism was aware of this problem from the beginning. If you have insiders, then what's the status of outsiders? And endlessly, the tradition is endlessly restless about that.
it? It's a paradox, both.
Yeah.
So if we, to wrap up, it'd be interesting, do you think that neighborliness has a paradox within it?
Yes.
And what are some of those paradoxes?
Well, the one we're talking about
Yeah.
in my mind. Who's my neighbor? And the idea that we've been talking about here, that a group of people who are face-to-face enough that they can understand each other's gifts always creates this commitment that makes a bigger boundary on the outside. That's the dilemma that I've seen in my work over all of the years, and in thinking about organizing communities. Judith Snow was a good friend of mine, a woman who was born with no ability to move any part of her body but her face. And she said to me, every group that we're interested in creates a commitment within and exclusion without. And our job is to be the people inside who work to ensure a welcome at the edge. And that's guided me a great deal.
You know, I also think neighborliness is separate from affection. And because I don't choose my neighbors, mostly, and some of them I don't like particularly, or I'm not drawn to them. And so what? We have a job to do, is what we try to do with an abundant community. But we have to raise some children, we've got to deal with some loneliness, we've got to have enough exchange so that we're all healthy. And so neighborliness is not a romantic idea. You know, it gets confused with like-mindedness.
Right.
And like-mindedness keeps the edge of the boundary too large.
Right.
And that one of the unintended or intended consequences of the technology, it allows me to live a like-minded world without having to get close to strangers. And so I just like the notion that the place forces me to have, if I have an affection for the place, and I feel that way where I'm living now and what I'm doing now, that I have to be cordial and make eye contact with people that, in another situation I'm arguing about, against. And I've gotten to some conflicts with neighbors over things that don't really matter, but there they were. And I see them in the grocery store. What the hell do I do? You know, stay out of produce until they're full, until they're through, sneak my way and go get the dairy first in hopes that they'll be gone. And after a while, you hell with it. And so I think, that's neighborliness.
Yeah.
Is we're forced to live together because we care for the common good.
Right. Yeah.
You know, the privatization is what we're looking for an alternative to. The common good is an alternative to the privatization, which means I can circle myself. The property rights, you can take at any level that you want, as back far as you want. But the common good, to me, means that we got to figure out what we're going to do with each other. And that matters more than how I might fare in this moment. So people say, what's in it for me? And I have a great answer to that. And the answer is, I have no idea what's in it for you. Why would you ask me what's in it for you? But you're my leader. You're my author. You're my this. I know I am. How pathetic is that? And so you're constantly trying not to answer these questions. They want to push you back into likeness. And so neighborliness is really is learning to love and be with a stranger. And that never goes away.
Exactly right.
Yep.
It also, though, has, in most people's minds, an association with place.
Yeah.
Now, and in the associational world, I think of two kinds of associations. One are affinity. I belong to a group of people who like to play poker. Right? I belong to a group of people who have this kind of dog. So affinity is defined already by some category that people will gather around. Neighborhood is, particularly in modern society, not that. By and large, everybody is in a place not because there is a particular affinity among them. So I think it is the great experiment in how can we create community and live a democracy. Because like-mindedness guides all the other associations, right?
Yep.
But here now is a living situation where I need to learn what Peter is just talking about.
Yep.
I need to learn how to be in community with people for whom a lot of things about them I don't like. And that, Peter, is why the gift orientation is so important. Because in that setting, the only way I know to ensure a kind of coming together with affect is to say, what do you have to offer? You're so valuable.
Right.
Come now. We need you. And so the gift is at the center of making a place into a neighborhood.
Well, this has been the Common Good Podcast, conversations at the intersection of place, belonging, and remembering. You can learn more about the work of Peter, John, and Walter, as well as the Common Good Fellowship and our daily Food for Thought emails at commongood.cc. We're also excited about Season 2 of the Common Good Podcast that starts next week. The fellowship program is underway, and we had our first on-site, and there a number of fellows as well as advisors from all sorts of contexts, including international contexts, were in town. And we began some conversations with practitioners like Afwina Cameron, who is from New Zealand, and she describes a little bit about how their local elders started putting this work into practice and how in the last 4 years this has turned into a formational practice in their community organizing and leadership.
One of our elders had been reading some of Peter Block's work, and he gave us the structure of community to read, and actually we really recognised a lot of the fundamental kind of teachings in that book resonated with some of our cultural values. And so what we developed from there was really a program around awakening our communities, and we've been doing it for about 4 years. It's been based on that book, on those series of conversations, but I would say it's really been with our flavour added to it. A lot of our own cultural thinking, our own values, our karakia, our proverbs, our processes have been incorporated into it.
So stay tuned, and next week jump into this next season with us. Common Good is a collaborative production of The Hive, a center for contemplation, art, and action, and common change, eliminating personal economic isolation. We're produced by myself, Troy Bronsink, and Joey Taylor. Music is written and produced by Jeff Gorman. It's been a real joy sharing these conversations with you, and there's a lot more to discover at commongood.cc. If you haven't been there yet,
You better get your ass in gear. You know.